Good morning, everybody. It is a great honor for me to be part of your celebration of two very important anniversaries. So my warmest congratulations to Polish Humanitarian Action, to the University of Warsaw, and to NOHA. The celebration of anniversary is a time to mark the enduring relevance of one's presence, to reflect on accomplishments and progress made, and to commit to one's aspiration for the future. 25 years in human lifespan is equivalent to a generation. It is a passage from birth to adulthood, from youth to maturity. Those of you in this hall who are now in the positions of influence would have only just started your career 25 years ago. So I'd like to take this opportunity to reflect on the meaning of maturity and aspiration for the humanitarian community. So I'll divide my speech into 4 parts. First, I'll recall 3 main events that have shaped the last 25 years of humanitarian action. The second part will be on the coming of age of this generation in the World Humanitarian Summit. Third, I'd like to talk about 2 areas where we have not matured, in other words, 2 current challenges. And lastly, what we should wish for the next generation. If we're speaking of maturity, perhaps a good place to start is to recall what the humanitarian world was like 25 years ago. About the same time NOHA was formed and when Polish Humanitarian Action, under its former name Equilibre, made its preparation for aid convoys to Sarajevo, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 46-182 was passed in December 1991. It can arguably be called the first attempt to formalize an international humanitarian system. International humanitarian assistance, of course, was not invented only a generation ago. From the battlefields of Solferino in 1859 to the shipment of wheat from North American farming cooperatives to a starving Soviet Union in the 1920s, to the post-Second World War rise in multilateral and international organizations such as UNHCR or Oxfam, organized assistance to alleviate massive human suffering has been a feature of modern international solidarity. We know that Resolution 46-182 was based on a Western concept of humanitarian assistance, one that can be traced back to Henri Dunant and the Red Cross. It posited a possible and permissible form of organized outside intervention to alleviate human suffering and preserve human dignity in violent conflicts and natural disasters. This outside intervention will be characterized by 3, later than 4, of the Red Cross principles, now known as the Humanitarian Principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. The contours of the system under Resolution 46-182 are no doubt familiar to you: the position of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Interagency Standing Committee that is made up of major UN agencies and the consortia of international NGOs, coordination under the OHA and humanitarian coordinators, and executed through various instruments and arrangements such as the coordinated appeals. Resolution 46-182, as all landmark events, was a product of a confluence of events. It came at the end of the Cold War and before the rise of China. So therefore, it was possible for the dominant Western countries to push through the resolution, even as it failed to take into account Islamic or Asiatic notions of humanitarianism. Without oversimplifying this point, the over-reliance on the Dunantist philosophy and the IASC Center system in Resolution 46-182, among other things, did not take into account the religious imperatives in Islamic humanitarianism, not only for observant Muslims, but also for the leaders of Islamic countries. In Asia, in part because of the dominance of China in early millennia, there were echoes, even in the late 20th century, of Confucianism-inspired governance model that placed the state's responsibility in the apex, including as the preeminent humanitarian benefactor. And coming at the end of the Cold War, certainly not any communistic humanitarianism from socialist solidarity would be incorporated. Yet UN Resolution this UN resolution aimed to be the foundation of global action in addressing massive human suffering. Resolution 46/182 envisioned a business model, crudely put, of wealthy Western countries funding international humanitarian organizations coordinated by a UN entity, OHA, to work in poor and fragile states. National and local actors were hardly taken into consideration. Southern countries, having suffered 19th century colonialism and 20th century Cold War proxy wars, were not in a position to challenge the paternalistic optimism of Northern-dominated multilateralism. Resolution 46/182 was passed also in the wake of Operation Lifeline Sudan. The Sudanese civil war from 1983 to year 2004 was Africa's longest-running civil war. It resulted in an estimated 2 million deaths and created searing images of massive population displacement into the large and unsanitary, disease-ridden camps in barely habitable terrain. Led by UNICEF, Operation Lifeline Sudan, or OLS, was established in 1989. It was a consortium of UN agencies and over 30 NGOs. It was a vast operation of cross-border airdrops and relief supplies flown into Sudan, mainly for the displaced in the southern regions. As Western countries mainly allied with southern rebels, OLS was heavily funded by the Western donors. Operation Lifeline Sudan has a number of lasting impact on the humanitarian community and on global perception of humanitarian action. As a result of the huge amount of available funding, a number of hitherto small-size agencies became significant global players through the OLS experience. OLS also called for an examination of conscience among humanitarian organizations. Food aid was used as a weapon of war by both sides, and humanitarian organizations felt complicit in it. As a legacy, the most lasting impact is on the public's, and indeed on many humanitarian actors' perception of humanitarian crises and humanitarian aid. The image of large numbers of dispossessed people running into barely habitable land, congregating in vast camps set up by humanitarian agencies, being aided by high-drama airdrops, was so indelible, it continues to be assumed to be the prototypic picture of humanitarian crises. As someone said, we still cannot get over the truck and dump model of humanitarian assistance and what a refugee should look like. One only needs to recall the backlash against the Syrian teenage refugees who used their cell phones to record the survival of the Mediterranean crossing in 2015, or how ill-equipped the humanitarian organizations were in coping with the first million of Syrian refugees in neighboring countries because they were not in camps. Operation Lifeline Sudan and Resolution 46/182, one experiential and the other structural, both laid some arguably false assumptions that are now the basis of a number of the challenges for humanitarian action. As we moved into the 21st century, the war that has the most significant impact on humanitarian action has been the global war on terror. Declared over by 2013 by the Obama administration, there are, however, continuing campaigns by various state militaries against ISIS, that is Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates, as well as terrorism attacks on countries around the world by these same groups. So for this reason, I use the term global war on terror as a military metaphor to denote a continuing global conflict and not as a precise term. The global war on terror is an asymmetric war that does not recognize state boundaries. It also involves a number of Western powers as belligerents, who are also the world's biggest humanitarian donors. The nature of the asymmetric warfare of global war on terror and the commingling of the military and aid roles have resulted in difficulties in distinguishing between belligerents and non-belligerents, and between humanitarian aid and aid for a security agenda. In this commingling of roles, both sides have reasons to distrust and exploit the aid providers. The protagonists of the global war on terror would want to control the conduct of the war and all implicated activities, including humanitarian action. One manifestation was the anti-terrorism legislation of the UK and the US that has caused much operational difficulties for humanitarian organizations. The targeted parties of the global war on terror, when they have control of territories and peoples, are hostile to aid agencies funded by the protagonists. It is therefore not surprising that according to one set of statistics, 75% of acts of violence against aid workers are in 5 countries, 4 of which are implicated in the global war on terror. The bombing of the Canal Hotel in Baghdad in 2003 was the early sign of these clashes. It altered massively and maybe even irreversibly the conduct of humanitarian action in conflict zones. It killed 22 people, including the UN Special Representative Sergio Vieira de Vello, a former head of OHA, and it was claimed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Canal Hotel bombing was followed rapidly by a series of bombing, including an attack on the Red Cross compound, and the message was clear. Humanitarian workers were no longer considered neutral and impartial and were legitimate targets of the conflict. The message set a precedent for belligerent perception and treatment of aid workers henceforth. It laid bare humanitarians' claim of exceptionalism. On the part of the humanitarian agencies, the global budgets ballooned exponentially in the years that followed, with little relation to the fluctuating size of beneficiaries, nearly always justified through a securitization lens. The global war on terror engaged Western militaries in conflicts in Muslim countries against both state and non-state actors. One impact is that it has become a factor, though not the only factor, in the large spikes in humanitarian need in a number of Muslim-majority countries. To illustrate, in 1999, that's before global war on terror, the top 10 recipient countries of humanitarian aid were spread across Europe, Africa, and Asia, with only 4 being Muslim-majority countries. In 2017, 7 of the top 10 appeals are from Muslim-majority countries. Indeed, 4 of the top 5 appeals, each requesting amounts $1 billion or more, come from Muslim-majority countries. The increase in humanitarian needs in Muslim-majority countries coincided with and resulted in an increase in Islamic charities and national organizations involved in humanitarian work to expand their operations outside of the domestic borders. So let's turn to the World Humanitarian Summit. In many ways, the World Humanitarian Summit was the era of the Resolution 46-182 coming of age. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about it. The Summit Global Consultation Synthesis Report, Restoring Humanity, Global Voices Calling for Action, was a culmination of a 2-year process. Hundreds, if not thousands, of research projects, workshops, analyses, and reports were commissioned by the Summit Secretariat or undertaken independently in parallel efforts. Literally tens of thousands of people across the globe participated in 2 years of conversation. This body of work not only chronicled the major humanitarian events of the past 25 years, but also made a good attempt to put the era in a context of the history and cultures of the globe. It reviewed and consolidated all the lessons learned and reform efforts. It reached out to an extraordinarily broad range of stakeholders and unleashed tremendous energy and imagination, and not a small dose of cynicism. The Global Consultation Synthesis Report valiantly tried to shoehorn all the voices into 5 themes: dignity, safety, resilience, partnerships, and finance. But if you look at the report closely, most of the points made were simply trying to address the issues that were the false starts of Resolution 46-182, which included having constructed a supply-driven system rather than a demand-driven system, an overemphasis on multilateral and international organizations at the expense of national and local actors, including governments, the claim of humanitarian exceptionalism through our humanitarian principles, and the wariness of other sectors and actors, and a belief in the superiority of the Western way. Emerging from the Geneva Global Consultation Conference 7 months before the summit, the buzzwords were people-centered, localization, partnership, inclusivity, and the humanitarian ecosystem. Then, the Secretary-General's report came out, and it was supposed to be the blueprint for the summit. It was an unexpected turn of event. It was not the natural progression from the global consultation that was anticipated. Instead of addressing the future of humanitarian action, the Secretary-General's report was on our collective responsibility to humanity. The former Secretary-General used the report to address directly the UN member states on political solutions and to all humanitarian stakeholders on the responsibility to humanity in our collective action. He did not shy away from confronting the geopolitics and the conduct of conflict that has perpetrated the requirement for humanitarian action. He did not dwell on reforming the international humanitarian system. He wanted to end the need. The report took many by surprise and led to criticisms that the World Humanitarian Summit process has lost its way, that it drowned in a sea with bigger sharks, the political actors, the peace builders, the climate change warriors, and the sustainable developers. The critics failed to see the key message of the Secretary-General, which was, the plight of the people in humanitarian crises is not a fallout from humanitarian affairs. It is a global affair. The World Humanitarian Summit was the last step in a summit series that included the Paris Summit, the Sendai World Conference, and the Summit on Sustainable Development. To Ban Ki-moon, humanitarian concerns must be put amongst the critical global challenges of our times, requiring, as he put it, a new era of international relations, one of unity and cooperation. In that, the Secretary-General's report went farther than the almost internal discourse of the global consultation. The former Secretary-General asked the world to look not only to fixing extent inadequate results and gaps in humanitarian response, but to beyond for solutions to massive human misery. The summit, in the end, did not achieve its political objective. It was attended by only a few major heads of state and heads of governments. There was not a real willingness to alter the geopolitical dynamics that would significantly reduce the number of forcibly displaced, nor facilitate better access to the aid they needed. In my opinion, though, the World Humanitarian Summit was a very successful aid summit. Notwithstanding the no-show of the major political leaders, the vast majority of the 173 attending member states were represented by a Minister of Development or above. It was also attended by a staggering range of humanitarian stakeholders, with one exception, the military representation. While we are all still trying to make sense of the thousands of commitments made and wonder how much water they hold, the more important developments from the summit was actually in the many major initiatives that were launched and or showcased there. They fall into 4 broad categories, and I'm only cherry-picking a few to mention. The first area is in the change in the way we view crisis-affected people, to putting them in the center and also recognizing them as agents and not as victims. I need to mention, for example, the core humanitarian standards document that was heavily promoted at the summit, and initiatives such as the Charter on Inclusion of Persons and Disabilities, the Education Cannot Wait Fund for Education in Emergencies, and the Leaders Roundtable on Women and Girls. The second area involves initiatives of collaboration and partnerships to address the changing humanitarian context. There was a multi-stakeholder global accord on healthcare for crisis-affected people. A global alliance on urban crisis was launched involving municipalities. and a new V20-led global partnership for preparedness for the most vulnerable countries to deal with risks caused by climate change. The third area is in innovative humanitarian financing. It is a harbinger of financing change in the humanitarian system. Noteworthy were the ones related to Islamic social finance, including a humanitarian sukuk, that is an Islamic equivalent of a social impact bond, and crowdfunding platforms, solutions to facilitate waqf, which is endowment, and zakat, which is mandatory alms giving for humanitarian purpose. The Global Business Coalition for Education to mobilize $100 million in contribution towards Education Cannot Wait Fund was an initiative entirely of the private sector. Showcased also was a recently launched humanitarian impact bond, a brainchild of ICRC and the Belgian government. These innovations will not alter significantly the dollar or euro or Saudi riyal amounts available immediately, but they include players who were not just the Western government donors. Lastly, there were efforts aimed at changing significantly the way we do humanitarian action. While cash transfer programs did not originate from the summit, it received considerable profile and promotion and commitment there. A number of initiatives were announced aimed at fostering localization, including the Grand Bargain's call for donors to channel 25% of direct funding to local and national actors. The Grand Bargain's call for transparency dovetailed with the launch of the Humanitarian Data Center in The Hague. It was also helped by the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which spent 2 years making its data standards and protocols usable by humanitarians. Regionally, a new network of regional organizations was formed, not only to improve coordination and cooperation, but to seek to formalize the role of regional organizations within the humanitarian architecture. These initiatives promoting localization, transparency, regional ownership, and together with cash-based programming will necessitate structural changes, will change the current dominance of international humanitarian agencies, and will call into question the long-held adherence to sectoral specialization. When I looked at these 4 areas of change where major initiatives were launched, announced, or showcased at the summit, I cannot help but believe that Istanbul was where we shared our 20th century way of approaching humanitarian assistance, and when we turned to a more 21st century way of thinking about humanitarian action, and when we turn to a more 21st century way of thinking about humanitarian action. Okay, so now let's turn to where humanitarian action has not sufficiently matured. The difference in the reception of the Global Consultation Synthesis Report and the Secretary-General's Report illustrates well the current challenges to humanitarian action. The challenges for humanitarian action have been well studied and debated during the World Humanitarian Summit process and associated activities. These are the factors that demand adaptation because of the changing environment exogenous to humanitarian action, such as climate change, urbanization, or technology. Or they are obstacles within the humanitarian system or the humanitarian community to be removed so that we, as the humanitarians, can do what we say we want to do. They include addressing issues, as the British think tank ODI put it, of legitimacy, capacity, and means. The summit outcome stayed largely within the scope of these challenges. The challenges to, rather than the challenges for humanitarian action, on the other hand, are the powerful forces of geopolitics, governance, and warfare that generate and sustain humanitarian crises, creating massive forced displacement and insecurity, including for aid workers, and or reducing everyday life to a fight for survival for a large swath of the population. This was the subject of the Secretary-General's report. But the report or the summit outcome never fully answered the question, what can the humanitarian community do about them? There are 2 areas that are particularly illustrative, access and protection. So let's talk about them for a moment. It is a truism in the humanitarian circle that all conversations eventually lead back to the humanitarian principles. The years following 9/11 saw donor countries coming to terms with the changed geopolitical context and new demands by calling for policies such as linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, the coherence agenda, stabilization, and the integrated approach. In Iraq and Afghanistan, there was an overt militarization of aid. An often heard lament was the phrase, shrinking humanitarian space. I'm sure you've heard of it. A frequently cited solution to the problem was a return to the humanitarian principles on the premise that they were, quote, deemed to foster greater acceptance, allowing humanitarian organizations to operate, unquote. Here I'm quoting from Jan Eglund, a former ERC, in a 2011 article. Yet the link between the principles and access to crisis-affected people is one of the humanitarian beliefs on which we in fact have very little empirical evidence. With or without evidence, though, this belief is central to the place of the principles in the humanitarian heart. Reading history, to echo what I said before, what the do-nontism has given us since the beginning was the notion that humanitarian action could be a form of permissible outside intervention. From its early history, it seemed that the principles were part of an implicit deal. The belligerents would acknowledge a party's observance of the humanitarian principles, and the party, i.e. the Red Cross, would not interfere with the conflict. Now in the 21st century, the nature of conflict and conflict management have changed, and there are many more actors offering aid in the same humanitarian context. More often than not, the belligerents challenge the humanitarian principles. At the same time, the non-Red Cross humanitarian actors do seek to influence the conduct of conflict, including through protection efficacy. A lot of intellectual sophistication has been expanded in the past decades to define neutrality so as to accommodate this efficacy. In the World Humanitarian Summit process, there was a discrete murmuring of relegating neutrality and independence to a lower level of priority. This is usually done with a nod to Jean Pictet's commentary on the Geneva Conventions and his hierarchy of the 7 Red Cross principles from which the 4 humanitarian principles derived. I think this suggestion is largely because the link between humanitarian principles and access is increasingly seen as tenuous. In the more recent crises, some groups for whom the humanitarian principles are not central are seen to have better access. I can name, for example, Syrian diaspora groups or the Islamic charities of the Gulf states. It seems that the discrete murmuring was really an attempt to resolve the discomfort around this weaker and weaker link. It strikes me that much of the angst among the traditional humanitarian actors about principles and access in the era of global war on terror was about how to get back to a deal we thought was about principles in exchange for access. They continue to point to ICRC's advantage, attributing it to its being more strictly principled. They forget that ICRC's bona fide with regards to neutrality and independence is also distinguished by strict adherence to confidentiality, which a lot of us don't adhere to. In the 21st century, it is not about the deal anymore for 2 reasons: the proliferation of non-traditional aid providers and our better understanding of the affected people and their communities. Let's look at the so-called non-traditional actors. The World Humanitarian Summit process has clearly shown that humanitarian action is not just the purview of the IASC-centered system and the Red Cross movement. There are now overlapping networks of actors operating in the humanitarian theater, whether we're talking about military actors, the private sector, aid foundations and non-governmental organizations from regionally significant states, local and state authorities and the civil protection apparatus, and supra-state entities. The list goes on. Many of them pursue the same humanitarian objectives as the traditional humanitarian actors. What distinguishes these actors from the traditional actors is that most are multi-mandated. their ability to provide aid does not depend on the deal because their mandate permits different relationships with the parties to the conflict. See, for example, the Saudi-based aid in Yemen, or because of their own modus operandi, as, for example, local community groups that have been there for generations. Today, effective and accessible aid in a humanitarian context is no longer solely provided by an authoritative core group who defines itself by the humanitarian principles. Another strong current in the World Humanitarian Summit process, as previously mentioned, was the call to refocus humanitarian action on the crisis-affected people themselves. With the impact of technology and the ubiquity of cell phones, internet, and social media, the connected world has given us a new humanitarian phenomenon of enabled self-help and digital humanitarianism. Anyone not familiar with these phrases should go online and get acquainted with Patrick Meyer. The new respect for affected people as actors and not victims has shifted the definition of access. It is no longer just about agencies' ability to reach them, but how they can be enabled and assisted to get the help they need. In this shift, the linkage between the principles and access is no longer a central concern. Let's turn to the second issue of protection. Throughout the World Humanitarian Summit process, the humanitarian community rightly reaffirmed the centrality of protection in humanitarian action. At the same time, there was general acknowledgement that apart from the better delineated areas of asylum protection, gender-based violence, child protection, and mine action, this is a very ill-defined area of humanitarian intervention. For clarity, OCHA on Message explains protection as in three parts. 1, responsive actions to alleviate the immediate effect of violence and abuse, put a stop to it or prevent its recurrence. 2, remedial action to ensure the provision of basic needs, restore dignity, and ensure well-being and recovery through assistance and rehabilitation. And 3, environment building action that aims to create a social, cultural, institutional, and legal environment conducive to respect for rights. All three areas pose considerable dilemma and contradiction for humanitarians. While the first area conceives of direct and indirect action to confront violence and abuse, it is only possible in low-grade situations. It is precisely when people need protection most that humanitarian actors are usually removed from the scene because of security restrictions. The second point of remedial action strains to distinguish protection from humanitarian assistance. It is a reasonable question, for example, to ask whether the careful location of sanitation facilities in camps, in the proverbial example of safety for women and girls, is about protection, or is it just about proper sanitation programming? It is usually in the third point of environment building action that humanitarian organizations undertake protection advocacy, including documentation and denunciation. It is an undertaking that can call to question the advocate's neutrality. Writing from his experience in Darfur, Marc Dubois of MSF said eloquently, quote, "The humanitarian apparatus in Darfur becomes the primary vehicle via which to transmit violence concern to the larger world. In many contexts, it has thus become the primary vehicle through which populations exercise their right to be protected from harm. If the people employ the humanitarian community as its protector, then any hope of neutrality vis-à-vis the perpetrators is destroyed. Indeed, we become positioned as the enemy of the beneficiary's enemy," unquote. The 21st century has already seen three defining protection crises for the humanitarian community: the Darfur conflict, the final months of the Sri Lanka civil war, and the Syrian war, though it goes without saying that every conflict is a protection crisis. The Darfur conflict that began in 2003 was arguably the crisis that definitively incorporated the rights-based approach into humanitarian intervention and changed the language from humanitarian assistance and relief to humanitarian action. It was no longer only about the needs of the affected people, but also about the obligation to respond. This obligation and the failure of the United Nations to visibly respond to the Sri Lankan government's final assault in 2008-9 to the Tamil civilians in a bid to end the 30-year civil war, or terrorism as defined by the government, has now entered into the realm of folklore as a humanitarian failure. As the Syrian political protests morphed into civil war, the first year of the war was a pure protection crisis, in that it did not require major relief intervention. I think it is a fair statement that the international humanitarian community was both clueless and impotent as to how to respond. It was only when the conflict deepened, ultimately creating a massive refugee crisis, that the international community was able to find its footing. It was then back to doing what we knew how to do, advocating and providing for refugees. The chapter still has to be written on how the humanitarian actors have fared inside Syria. All three crises demonstrate well that the humanitarian protection is intricately bound up with the politics of the crises, whether it was supplying or not information from Darfur to the International Criminal Court, constructing the narrative on casualties in Sri Lanka, or getting a Security Council resolution to authorize cross-border operation from Turkey to Syria. Politics was never far away. How then do we square the circle? Do humanitarian principles still matter? I believe the humanitarian principles are extremely important because more than any other concepts, they are fundamental to our self-identification and for distinguishing our work from any other kind. Especially in an environment of increasing number of actors, by self-declaring as adherents to the principles, the humanitarian community is affirming our reasons for intervening. The humanitarian principles continue to resonate because they give us a distinctive form of aid. It is altruistic, not instrumentalized, and based solely on the alleviation of human suffering. All too easily and often, especially in complex emergencies, aid carries with it many motives. The humanitarian principles help us guard against instrumentalization. Ultimately, principled humanitarian aid helps us to ensure that one, when all else fails, when no one would or could see any reason to intervene, the humanitarian instinct can still spring into action. And two, amidst all other forms of instrumentalized aid, there does not remain any group unaided because they do not fit someone's purpose of instrumentalization. From this perspective, whether our work is humanitarian or not should not be about the binary characteristics, that is principled or not, of the provider. It is more important to take account of the objectives of the intervention, that is whether it is altruistic, whether it is non-instrumentalized, given according to need, for the purpose of saving lives, alleviating suffering, and preserving human dignity. In that, a core outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit, putting the affected people in the center, will serve as a guide. On humanitarian access, the concept of people-centered means that humanitarian actors should focus not on how the principled we can gain access to those in need. Rather, we should dedicate concerted effort to finding the ways and means to enable and assist the affected people to access the help they need from the best non-instrumentalized source available. Studies have already shown that international humanitarian organizations are not the primary aid providers in humanitarian crises. Studies after studies have shown that crisis-affected people turn first and foremost to family, friends, and neighbors before turning to organized outside help. International organizations are in many cases not even the primary aid provider among the organized ones. technology has also permitted efficient communication between the affected people and the broader world. Allow me to retell a remark I made at the World Humanitarian Summit. After listening to all the presentations, I asked, why was it that in all the discussion on access, we talked only about the humanitarians' access and not about the people's access? It was as if we were having a conversation about low-income people's access to nutritious food and only talked about the penetration of supermarket chains into the neighborhood. It's time to let go of the empirically unsupported preoccupation with the link between humanitarian principles and access. Shifting to the call of the World Humanitarian Summit to grounding protection in humanitarian action, I have heard commentary portraying this summit outcome as a vindication of the complaint that the humanitarian sector has disproportionately prioritized relief provision over protection obligations. I think this is a misreading. I believe that the summit's emphasis on protection-grounded humanitarian action meant all humanitarian intervention must aim to reduce vulnerability and/or increase security, and not just providing material relief. It was about altering the conditions of the affected people rather than the obligations and undertakings of the providers. Humanitarianism will not gain further traction if we only point to how others are not living up to our expectation with respect to the humanitarian principles. While still necessary and worthwhile, educating belligerents and their political peers on the obligations under international law can only go so far. Humanitarian effectiveness, that is, maximizing the chance that a crisis-affected person is protected and can get the help he or she needs, will require accommodation and not dogma. The World Humanitarian Summit welcomed diversity and partnership in the humanitarian ecosystem, including parties that did not necessarily subscribe to all of the humanitarian principles as long as there were common humanitarian objectives. When it comes to protection advocacy, we're in a world where belligerent parties use protection as proof of enemy activities and the excuse for obstruction. This is a world where violence is visited on aid workers. Humanitarian actors have to accept that in incorporating protection activities into humanitarian action, we too have blurred our own roles. Some activities are less neutral than others. Some activities will bring more danger. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. My own position is that principled humanitarian action by those who self-identify with the humanitarian principles should be the floor below which we should not fall. Our efforts to strive for improvement and for maximum humanitarian effectiveness requires that we go above and beyond that, to where we accommodate other actors who may or may not self-identify with the humanitarian principles, and to where we do not shy away from politics, to where we accept we're not always neutral, and to where we can reach the ceiling where conflicts are conducted according to international law and where needs of those affected are met by uninstrumentalized aid that is appropriate and timely. We've now come to the last part of my speech, and I thank you for the stamina in sticking with me. I said in the beginning that anniversary celebration is a time to trace the path of maturity and also to commit to one's aspiration for the future. We have in the audience the next generation of humanitarians. What is our wish for them? I think in the next years, we will see a more dangerous and less caring world. I still shake my head in disbelief that 500,000 Rohingya leaving Myanmar in 1 month, 19 million people needing humanitarian aid in Yemen, and a 14% drop in Puerto Rico's population after Hurricane Maria are greeted by the administration of the United States, the world's largest humanitarian donor, with a political shrug. I think it is important that as humanitarians, we never lose our outrage or our compassion. The World Humanitarian Summit has shown the humanitarian community's ability to mature, at least in our rhetoric. The hard part is putting our words to deeds. It is not easy for a $20+ billion enterprise to change its business models, to replace its operational infrastructure, and indeed to alter its mindset or beliefs. This hard work will fall to the present and future generation of humanitarians. It raises some very interesting questions for academics and for practitioners. I think I'm not entirely judgmental in saying that academic humanitarian research focuses more on theories and concepts and less on what works. We are also exceedingly limited in our research methodology. Approaching humanitarian action from the point of view of crisis-affected people requires a lot more robust empirical studies involving them. It is odd that a field that collects so much data actually has not really produced a solid body of work on what works for the people. I hope that the new Humanitarian Data Center in The Hague and other transparency initiatives emanating from the World Humanitarian Summit will facilitate future researchers in this direction. In that, I'm echoing what Professor Herman said earlier about academia be in the service of humanitarian action. I also hope that humanitarian education programs will better equip future researchers with more advanced research methods for more robust analyses. When it comes to education in humanitarian affairs, educational programs have done much in the past 25 years to professionalize the field, raising qualifications and standards. It is a very laudable achievement. At the same time, the professional culture that has emerged has inadvertently fostered our sense of exceptionalism and introversion. When our community is increasingly asked, indeed required, to work with other actors and other sectors of society, we should increase our attention to not only educating the future humanitarian practitioners, but also educating humanitarian affairs students who aspire one day to become top diplomats, business leaders, military elite, technology innovators, and award-winning journalists or bloggers. Our curriculum should include the crossover knowledge, content, and skills development to make that possible. The future humanitarian practitioners will be involved less in the truck and dump relief delivery. They will have to accept more and more occupational danger. They will have to be more agile, collaborative, and adaptable. There is no place for self-righteousness. Their job will be easier if they are as at ease talking to politicians or techies as talking to lawyers and logisticians. My wish for you, the future humanitarians in the audience, is that every day that you are a humanitarian, you put your focus squarely on the crisis-affected people and their capacities. When you do your analysis, when you do your planning, when you undertake operational activities, when you evaluate, when you develop policies, my wish is that you never lose sight of them and their capacities, as we so often did in the past 25 years, and that you never turn cynical. If you can do that, then you will be a better generation than ours. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.